What was it like to be a pagan in the late Roman Empire? That is a question that I have often asked myself, since of course the era of the later Roman Empire is very fascinating, but the monumental shift that took place in those times from the classical Greco-Roman religion of the Romans towards Christianity makes this era all the more intriguing. How must it have been for the pagans in that changing world? Could they still freely practice their old beliefs? In short, how was life for a pagan in the late Roman Empire? Since the earliest days of the Romans, when Rome itself was founded, the Romans worshipped, like many other cultures of those days, a multitude of different gods. Naturally, of course, the Romans were influenced by the older cultures, such as the Greeks or the Etruscans. An exchange of ideas and beliefs took place, and so it is of course only logical that there would be common themes among the belief systems of all the cultures of the Mediterranean in the 8th century BC when Rome was founded. Etruscan and Greek influence was of course strongest, and so it is no surprise that there emerged a great similarity of the Roman belief system with, for instance, the Greek pantheon of gods. Even while Rome expanded and the Roman Republic became the dominant power in the Mediterranean, the Romans were actually religiously very tolerant. New cults and belief systems were just left as they were, and many times new cults and beliefs were just added to the already existing ones. Interestingly, there was no real unified religious system in form of a state religion in the times of the Republic or of the Empire. Of course, the most dominant form of worship consisted of worshipping the pantheon of gods known from the Greeks, where the Greek deities then had a corresponding god in the Roman pantheon. But there was just a multitude of different cults and beliefs that it is somewhat difficult to even classify the religious beliefs of the Romans. Other cults would join the traditional Roman belief system, the cult of Mithras for instance, which already emerged as early as the 1st century AD, was especially popular with the soldiers of the Roman army. This cult entailed the worship of the god Mithras, and it was carried out in underground meeting places, so-called Mithraeums. Another cult that gained popularity after the 1st century AD was the cult of Sol Invictus, which was also very popular with soldiers. It consisted of worshipping the sun god Sol, of which Aurelian himself was a strong proponent. He even tried to make Sol Invictus the main religion of the Roman Empire. Another form of worship was the imperial cult. This was established in the early reign of Augustus, in which members of the imperial family were deified upon their deaths, therefore basically becoming gods, and also being worshipped in their own temples. Many of the temples throughout the whole Roman Empire were dedicated to passed away emperors, such as the famous temple of Divus Claudius or of Divus Augustus in Rome. So we see that the religious practices were manifold in the Roman Empire, and there was not just a single pagan religion. The term pagan itself was used from the mid-4th century onwards, but especially after the 5th century AD with the rise of Christianity, to denote people outside of the bounds of the Christian community, so basically non-Christians. Where this term pagan comes from is still debated. It might be derived from paganus, meaning civilian, or from pagus, meaning rural, from the countryside, so thus not of the city. But in fact, it is important to understand that the term was never used by the pagans themselves, of course, since they correctly saw themselves as Hellenes, adherents of the old Greco-Roman way of life, and their belief system thus as Hellenistic. Indeed, even many Christians themselves after the 4th century didn't call the adherents of the old cults pagans, but referred to them as Hellenes. During the age of the Republic and mid to High Empire, being a Hellene meant to participate in certain religious ceremonies. The sacrifice was a central aspect of that belief system, where specific gods were asked to help or support in exchange for a sacrifice. This could be as simple as an item that was placed on the altar of a specific god, or it could be the burning of incense, but of course it could go also as far as animal sacrifice. Indeed, the procedure of sacrificing animals was a common practice for hundreds of years during the Republic and the Empire. Many gods had their own devotees and their own temples, and especially in times of crises, many animals were sacrificed in very strict ritualistic procedures to the gods. It is said, for instance, that when Hannibal approached Rome, hundreds of oxen were sacrificed to Jupiter on the Capitoline Hill in order to save Rome. Superstition was extremely widespread, and the belief was strong that one's personal fate could be influenced by bringing a specific god sacrificial items. The Vestal Virgins were possibly Rome's most famous cult, which entailed worship of the goddess Vesta, the virgin goddess of hearth, home and family. A flame was kept burning in the temple of Vesta at Rome, and it was said that as long as the flame burned, Rome could not fall. The Vestal Virgins took an oath to serve the goddess for 30 years, and this also meant maintaining chastity for that entire time. And if this oath was broken, the punishments were exceptionally brutal. We can now say that for 1,000 years, many of these practices remained similar, almost unchanging. Since the earliest days of the Republic, Greco-Roman worship remained constant. One would pay respects from time to time to the favorite god of choice, of course, depending on the occasion. But of course, one didn't have to. There were some that we would nowadays call atheists, who did not follow any cult and just lived their lives, not heeding much attention to the gods. But those that did would visit temples, bring sacrificial items to their gods in the temples, burn incense, or even have an own small shrine in their houses or apartments on which they would place sacrificial items, for which of course they would expect protection from their respective god. This lifestyle would remain very similar for about 1,000 years until the rise of Christianity. This is when life for the Hellenes, for the adherents of the old traditional faith or faiths of the empire, be it the imperial cult, the Greco-Roman gods, the cult of Mithras or of Sol Invictus, would change forever. Salve and hello, dear friends of late Roman history. It's me, Sebastian, the creator and the person behind Maiorianus. As you know, Maiorianus is one of the very few channels on YouTube dedicated only to late Roman history. And as you also know, this is a super niche topic, which unfortunately very often doesn't get a lot of love from the YouTube algorithm. I therefore wanted to ask if you could support Maiorianus via a YouTube membership by clicking the join button below the video, or via a Patreon membership, and you can find the link to Patreon in the video description below. Your support and your support only is what makes Maiorianus possible, and I really need your support in order to keep Maiorianus a channel about late Roman history. Thank you again for your support. Majorian himself, I think, would be proud. Bene valete, friends of late Roman history, and back to the video. But things started to change very slowly at first. We could say that in the late reign of the Emperor Constantine, when he started openly favoring Christianity, which might have been after around 324 AD, we would see the first slow signs of change. Some of the ancient authors, such as Eusebius, wrote that it was Constantine who first banned pagan animal sacrifice, while others, such as Libanius, said that he did not. In a letter that Constantine wrote to the eastern provincials, though, he never mentioned any law against sacrifice. The evidence thus seems to be more in favor that Constantine allowed pagan worship and sacrifice to continue unchanged. So life as a pagan mostly went on unchanged in the early decades of the 300s. Not much changed in the cities of the Roman Empire, and even at Constantinople, the temples on the Agora remained open, and paganism continued unchanged. It was Constantine's son Constantius II who enacted the first real anti-pagan laws. Pagan sacrifice was banned under penalty of death, some of the pagan temples were ordered closed, and their wealth partially confiscated. However, even this is debated. There's also evidence that those laws were almost never enforced, and that even pagan sacrifice was still observed unchanged at Rome or Alexandria in broad daylight. Neither the Vestal Virgins were disbanded, nor did any senator of Rome openly protest the anti-pagan policies of Constantius. However, it appears that he did remove the altar of victory from the Senate House of Rome in 357 AD. He also passed a law against magic and divination, thus consulting a diviner, astrologer, or a soothsayer was made illegal. So thus we can assume that in general, even in the time of Constantius II, not much actually changed for the pagans, even though there were some of the first anti-pagan laws and actions. But pagan worship apparently, especially in the larger cities, continued unchanged. The laws against pagan sacrifice were quickly reversed by the Emperor Julian, and religious tolerance continued even after Julian, in the reigns of Jovian, Valens in the east, and Valentinian I in the west. The real first changes started during the reign of Gratian. In 382, Gratian was the first to formally, in law, divert those public financial subsidies that had previously supported Rome's cults to the imperial budget. He appropriated the income of pagan priests and the Vestal Virgins, forbade their right to inherit land, confiscated the possessions of the priestly colleges, and was the first to refuse the title of Pontifex Maximus. He also ordered the altar of victory to be removed again, since it had been restored under Julian. The colleges of pagan priests lost privileges and immunities. So this is when actually things started really changing in the empire. But even while the wealth of the pagan temples was confiscated and the altar of victory removed again from the Senate House at Rome, the regular Hellene would still visit the temples and shrines of the old gods without any repercussions. Life of pagans still mostly continued as it had before. Burning of incense, placing of sacrificial items on shrines, visiting the temples, it all went on. Even during the reign of Theodosius, which is often marked as the turning point for pagans in the late Roman Empire, even then, as archaeological evidence shows, destruction of pagan temples was very limited. It was found through archaeological excavations, for instance, that only 2.4% of all pagan temples in Gaul were ever destroyed by force. And in Italy, there is indeed only one example of the deliberate destruction of a temple. Yes, the altar of victory was removed from the Senate House, and the funds for the cult of the Vestal Virgins was appropriated, thus indeed marking the end of the Vestal Virgins. But strangely, even the notion that Theodosius ordered all Hellenistic temples closed is not 100% certain. Theodosius even replaced his Praetorian prefect with a pagan, and appointed the last two openly pagan consuls in 391. The notion thus that Theodosius forbade the Olympic Games and that he ordered all temples closed can thus not be verified with a high degree of confidence. As with previous examples, there is a lot of conflicting evidence on how exactly the increasingly Christian emperors actually dealt with paganism. It is clear though that as a pagan, one would feel the changes taking place from the late 300s onwards. First slowly though, in that open pagan sacrifices of animals were at some point given up and only performed secretly. Many old temples, while mostly not destroyed, were though indeed stripped of their ornaments or of their wealth. Therefore, probably the temples were just looking gradually more bleak, as the imperial funding was just withheld from them after Gratian, and so as a pagan, you would see the old places of worship just continue to decay, all the while of course church building activity would increase. And if you are like me, a total Rome nerd, or Romaboo as some people like to say, and I think that you are, or else you probably wouldn't be watching this video, then you might be interested in the incredible rings and other Roman accessories which the SPQR Shop is building. They make legionary rings, they make rings with different themes, they even make coin replicas, statues, pendants, attributes and terracottas. And the most incredible thing is that they handcraft every single piece. That's right, this is really high quality handcrafted material. there's really no better present for yourself or someone you know who might be a Rome fan. I put the link to their shop in the video description and into the pinned comment, and with this link you can now even get a 20% rebate for every purchase. I repeat, a 20% price reduction for every purchase from the SPQR Shop, which is just an absolutely insane offer, and you can only get it here via the Maiorianus link, because let me tell you, the people from SPQR Shop also are absolute fans of the heroic Emperor Maiorian. So go and check out their incredible assortment. There will be certainly also something for you. So the life of pagans changed very gradually in the 300s. I would say that only in the 390s would you really start feeling the changes, but even then, many pagan strongholds remained. For instance, Illyricum was a pagan stronghold even into the late 400s. Marcellinus of Dalmatia was openly pagan, and in that region, pagan temples were as open as ever, and many of the old pagan practices continued. If, however, animal sacrifice was still performed there by then is unknown. It probably fell more and more out of fashion, but of course, it is very conceivable that this practice continued well into later centuries in secret. With Honorius and Arcadius, anti-pagan laws were reissued, pagan sacrifice, divination and soothsaying were again banned, and by that time quite certainly the old pagan temples were given price to neglect, and no state money was used to repair them anymore. And thus, being a pagan in the 5th century meant that you would in most part have to practice your belief in secret. Many thus were openly Christians, but in secret continued praying to the old gods, having small secret altars in their houses, hidden in the cellar, or hidden in an old forgotten temple in the countryside. The altars of the deities in the large temples were mostly removed, apart from pagan strongholds such as Illyricum or Aphrodisias in Anatolia. Aphrodisias is especially interesting because even in the late 400s AD or around 500 AD, there was still a thriving pagan community living there, openly and surprisingly unpersecuted. We can find many of the last beautiful, naturalistic statues having been made there, and the Hellenistic temples there were open and absolutely intact. So as a pagan around 500 AD, while open paganism had been made ever more difficult by the increasingly intolerant emperors such as Honorius or Arcadius or following ones, one could still find some places where you could freely practice the worship of the ancestors. But even in other places, there were brief revivals. Laws by Maiorian ordered the protection of the old pagan temples in the west, and Anthemius was also very religiously tolerant, so that in those times, as a pagan, one possibly could also practice paganism without fear of persecution. But in cities such as Constantinople, of course, being much more Christian and being under the watchful eyes of the Christian emperors residing there, it is quite clear that as a pagan you would either choose to practice your belief secretly or move to pagan strongholds such as Aphrodisias or Illyricum. However, even in the 6th century there must have still been many pagans left, since Justinian enacted many anti-pagan laws. I would say that it is with Justinian that truly life as a pagan would become unbearable in the larger cities of the empire, since by that time indeed pagan temples were normally all either converted to churches or closed for good, and pagan literature was at times even openly burned. By that time, you would have no choice anymore other than being a crypto-pagan and practice your belief in secret, while pretending on the outside to be a Christian. However, far away from the big cities, paganism was still continued, and even in the 800s AD, there were still Hellenes in the countryside, such as the fascinating case of the Maenads shows, a group about which I made a video. So we can see that life of pagans differed very much depending on the time they lived in the late Roman Empire, and depending on where they lived. As a pagan, you could in some places even still freely practice your belief in the early 500s AD, while in other places such as Constantinople, you probably would have had trouble doing that already in the late 300s. And so of course more and more would abandon the old faith of their forefathers for the sake of simplicity, by peer pressure, and of course by acceptance of society. Only in rural areas could you continue being a Hellene, and the last ones then vanished around the year 1000. And please like and subscribe so that you won't miss any future videos on the fascinating era of the late Roman Empire. And I would of course like to thank everyone who is supporting Maiorianus in any form, be it through Patreon, YouTube membership, or through a PayPal donation. Thank you for supporting Maiorianus so that I can keep this a channel about late Roman history. And if you want to learn more about the Maniads, the last Hellenes, you can watch this video in the upper right corner. But if you want to learn more about Rome in those times, you can watch the other video in the lower right corner. I say thanks again to all friends of Roman history, gratias tibiago and bene valete.